My name is Lucinda Marrow, 58, a photo restoration specialist at the New Orleans Museum of Southern History. Most nights, I dream of another woman's life, a white woman named Evelyn Hartwell. In the dream, I am her. I wear her pale hands, her pearl ring. I stand by the window of a white wooden house by the lake. I call to a man in the next room. "Darling, dinner's ready." He turns, smiles, kisses me on the cheek, and for a moment, I believe the mirror, that the woman in it is me. When I wake, the air still smells of her perfume. White peony, a scent I have never owned. Sometimes the smell lingers on my wrist until noon, like a secret that refuses to wash off. That morning at work, I was restoring a post-war portrait series labeled Southern Legacies. Dozens of photographs of families with matching smiles and mismatched servants, all printed in sepia that had turned the color of dried tea. I worked alone in the lab, gloves on, magnifier over one eye, humming an old gospel tune to stay awake. The air was heavy with fixer, that metallic tang that burns the throat if you breathe too deep. Inside one of the yellowed envelopes was a brittle birth certificate. The paper crumbled at the edges, but the ink was still alive, blue and stubborn. Name: Evelyn Hartwell. Date: June 12, 1950. Mother: Lucinda M. Negro maid, age 20. For a second, I didn't understand what I was reading. Then my own name pulsed on the page like a wound reopening. The certificate slipped from my hand. The bottle of ink toppled, spilling across the document in slow motion, a dark wave swallowing the word Negro. My throat closed. The sound that came out was half breath, half prayer. Lucinda M. My last name, Marrow, begins with the same letter. M for what? Maid? Mother? Mistake? I pressed my gloved fingers over the infant's white handprint on the page. My skin showed through the latex, brown against pale blue paper. The contrast looked obscene, as if I were touching a ghost that didn't want to know me. The lab went silent except for the slow drip of ink onto the floor. Each drop landed like a heartbeat I couldn't claim. Every night I live her life. And now I know. I might have been the one who gave it to her. I sank onto the stool, the room spinning. Through the small window, the city carried on. Tourists, jazz, sunlight. While inside me, something ancient shifted. If memories could crawl back through generations, if dreams were just the echo of what history refused to print, then whose life was I dreaming? Whose story had been developed over mine, until my own face disappeared in the chemical bath? That was the moment the ground changed color beneath me. And it all began with one line on a piece of paper. Lucinda M. Negro maid, age 20. I was born in 1967, in the servants' quarters of the Hartwell estate, a mansion that smelled of lemon polish and quiet rules. My mother worked there for 30 years. She used to tell me, "You came into the world in the storage room behind the kitchen. The lady of the house let me keep you. Said every home needs a child's laughter, just not at the dinner table." She laughed when she said it, but there was always something tight around her mouth, like the memory itself was a bruise that never faded. When I was little, I thought that was kindness, that the Hartwells were generous for allowing us to exist in their house, even if we slept near the brooms. Now, I understand what kind of permission that really was. The first photograph I ever saw of myself was blurry. My mother holding me on the back porch, sunlight slicing her face in half. Half dark, half light. That was always our story. The Hartwell boy, Andrew, used to tease me. "You're lucky, Lucy. You get to play outside while we sit through piano lessons." Lucky. That word stuck to me for years, the way dust sticks to polished furniture. By the time I turned 18, I wanted nothing more than to leave that house and make something that belonged only to me. I moved to Baton Rouge in 1985, got a job at a photo lab. My hands smelled like vinegar and silver every night. I was fascinated by damaged photographs, the ones everyone else called beyond repair. Scratches, watermarks, overexposed faces. I couldn't stop staring at them. There was something holy about imperfection, like truth trapped under fog. I used to stay after hours, sewing torn negatives back together with a fine brush and patience. My boss said, "You've got a white eye and a black head, Lucinda. That's rare talent." He meant it as a compliment. I smiled, nodded, but when I got home, I'd scrub my hands until they burned. I didn't want that white eye. I just wanted to see clearly. The museum job came years later, after I'd built a small reputation for restoring portraits of Civil War widows and lost soldiers. People said I had a sensitive touch, that I brought back ghosts too gently. Every morning, I slipped on my white cotton gloves before touching any photograph. At first, it was just protocol, to protect the prints from oil and sweat. But soon, it became something else. The gloves turned into a border between my skin and theirs. Between the world that was allowed to be remembered and the one that wasn't. Whenever I handled an old photo, I'd see my reflection in the glass, my dark face hovering over their pale ones, and I'd pull the gloves tighter. It was my way of disappearing politely. My skin shouldn't stain their history, I used to think. So I learned to be invisible in the art of remembering. There were nights I'd fall asleep at the light table, head on my arm, dreaming in monochrome. Faces of white women fading in and out of focus, their eyes opening just as I woke up. Sometimes one of them would whisper, "Don't forget me." Sometimes it sounded like a warning. The work demanded precision. One speck of dust could ruin a whole frame. One mistake could rewrite a face. I spent years breathing in chemicals, cataloging hundreds of forgotten lives, making the dead beautiful again. No one ever asked whose hands did it, as long as the final image looked pure. And in some twisted way, I felt safe behind those gloves and lenses, safe from the raw contact of truth. Because truth, I learned early, was corrosive. It eats through paper, through stories, through skin. When I visited my mother in her final year, she barely remembered me. The dementia had set in like fog over the river. But one afternoon, while I was changing her bedsheets, she grabbed my wrist, tight. "Lucy," she whispered, her eyes glassy but fierce. "Don't let them keep you in the darkroom forever." Then she smiled, slow and broken. "You were born in light." I thought she was rambling. Now I think she was warning me. Back at the museum, the curator once joked, "You treat these white faces better than your own reflection, Lucinda." Everyone laughed. I did too. But later that night, in the mirror above my sink, I stared at my gloved hands. Still on. I realized I hadn't touched my bare face in hours. Didn't even know what it felt like anymore. The gloves, the chemicals, the flicker of projector light. They became my second skin. Each photo I restored was another rehearsal in pretending color didn't matter. Until, of course, that envelope appeared. The one with the birth certificate. The moment I saw my name printed next to Evelyn's, everything my mother had warned me about bloomed in my chest like acid. All those years of restoring their past, I had been restoring my own erasure. Sometimes I wonder if the dream started as a way for her, the mother I never fully knew, to tell me the truth. Maybe she had been trying to reach me through the negatives, through the faces I washed and fixed and framed. Or maybe Evelyn herself had been dreaming too. And somehow, we crossed wires. She dreamed my darkness, I dreamed her light. And between us, history blurred again. That's the curse of restoration. You can't bring something back without losing a piece of yourself. I thought I was preserving other people's memories. Turns out, I was bleaching my own. I still remember the first morning I ever stepped into a darkroom. The door closed behind me like a secret sealing itself shut. Everything was bathed in red light, the color of a heart seen from inside. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the sour sweet sting of developer. Someone had spilled fixer on the floor. It stuck to my shoes like syrup. The trays of liquid shimmered faintly, mirrors that moved when you breathed. I was 17, nervous and hungry to belong. When I looked down at the wet film floating in the tray, I saw a face forming, mine blurred and half erased. Half white, half black. I blinked, but the division stayed, a seam running right through me. The instructor, a tall man named Mr. Jenkins, came up behind me. He smelled of coffee and ash. He leaned close, peering at the film. "Don't be afraid, Lucinda," he said softly. "Light always chooses the ones brave enough to look back at it." I didn't fully understand what he meant, but the words wrapped around me like a thin, dangerous kindness. For the first time, I felt seen, not for my face but for my steadiness under the red glow. That was the day I learned how to breathe inside the dark. The lab became my second home. I loved the way time stretched there, how a minute could last forever when you waited for an image to appear. While other students flirted or joked, I watched faces rise from blank paper like slow miracles. When I wasn't printing assignments, I practiced on discarded negatives. Weddings, graduations, baby portraits. All white, all smiling. I told myself that the chemicals didn't care about race, light was colorless. But some nights, when everyone was gone, I would slip one of my mother's photographs under the enlarger. Her in her maid's uniform, holding a baby that wasn't me. And I would print it in the same fine paper they used for the Hartwells. Then I'd watch as her brown skin bloomed out of the milk-gray sheet, fragile and perfect. I never kept those prints. I always tore them up before dawn. I told myself it was practice. Truth was, I was afraid someone would see her face and ask questions I couldn't answer. When I finally got paid for my first job, $23 for restoring a soldier's portrait, I spent half of it on a pair of white cotton gloves. They weren't required in the student lab, but I wanted them. I wanted to look like the people in magazines, the conservators who handled art like relics. I wanted to touch the world without leaving fingerprints. The gloves became my armor. Whenever I wore them, I felt respectable, invisible in the right way. They hid the tremor in my hands and the color underneath. One afternoon, Jenkins asked me why I kept them on even when I wasn't working. I said, "Habit," he smiled, "or disguise." He wasn't wrong. That summer I fell in love for the first time with a camera older than I was, a Leica M3 rescued from a pawn shop. It was missing a screw and smelled of rust, but it fit in my palm like it had been waiting for me. I took pictures of everything. The alley cats behind my apartment, the condensation on bus windows, my reflection in shop glass. Every frame came out overexposed, as if the world refused to darken for me. I told Jenkins about it. He said, "You're letting in too much light." I didn't tell him that was exactly what I wanted. I wanted to drown in it. When I went home that Christmas, my mother looked at my stained fingers and laughed. "Girl, you've been bleaching yourself?" I told her it was just the chemicals. She held my wrist, studying the tiny burns on my skin. "Light leaves a mark too," she said. "Don't forget that." I didn't understand her then. Now I do. Every photograph I restored after that left a trace of its subject on me, just invisible enough to pass inspection. The last day of class, Jenkins handed me my final project back, a restored portrait of a pale-skinned bride. He pointed to the delicate line I'd painted along her veil. "Flawless," he said. "You make history look cleaner than it was." He meant it as praise. But I walked home sick with it because I knew he was right. I had cleaned away too much. I had made erasure look like art. Still, I couldn't stop. The darkroom was the only place I felt half alive, where mistakes could vanish with one wash of light. And somewhere deep inside, I believed that if I worked long enough, hard enough, maybe one day I'd fix the image in the mirror too, make it come out balanced, unblurred, whole. That was the dream that kept me going. To be developed properly. It would take me 40 years to learn what that actually meant. Years later, after I had already become one of the museum's senior restorers, the curator brought me a new assignment. The Hartwell Family Album. The name hit me with a strange pulse of familiarity. But in this job, the South is full of Hartwells, Fairbanks, and Crawfords. You learn not to flinch at pedigree. The box was wrapped in brown paper and sealed with brittle string. When I untied it, the smell of mildew and cedar rose up. The scent of rooms that have forgotten to breathe. Inside were dozens of glass negatives, some cracked like spiderwebs, others still sharp enough to cut skin. I turned on the desk lamp and began the slow ritual. Gloves, loop, soft brush. The first few plates were the usual heirloom poses: men in pressed uniforms, women holding parasols, a horse so still it looked embalmed. Then, about halfway through the stack, I found it. A photograph of a black woman holding a white infant. She wasn't in uniform, but her posture gave her away. The careful straightness of someone taught to make herself smaller than the person she carried. Her dress was plain, her hair wrapped in a scarf that had faded to the color of ashes. The baby's face was turned toward the camera, round and soft, almost glowing. I leaned closer. The name scratched beneath the image read, "Nurse and Baby Evelyn Hartwell." But the ink had bled, and the first name of the nurse was only half there. Lou. For a long moment I just stared at it. The red light from my lamp made the baby's skin shine, and the woman's eyes looked like holes cut into the world. Something cold uncoiled in my chest. I whispered to the empty room, "Lucinda?" "No, can't be." My own reflection stared back at me from the glass surface, my face hovering where hers had been. The logical part of me argued. Coincidence. Common name, common story. Every Southern archive has 100 photos like this. Women who raised other women's children. Bodies that history misfiled under help. Still, I slid the negative aside too carefully, as if it might burn. The rest of the afternoon I worked fast, almost frantic, cleaning, labeling, trying not to think. Each time I reached for another plate, my hands shook slightly inside the gloves. When I clocked out, I left the lab lights on by mistake. That night, the dream came back, sharper than before. I was in that same white house by the lake. Evelyn stood before a mirror, her belly round beneath a lace gown. The window was open, wind pushing the curtains like restless ghosts. She placed her hands on her stomach and whispered, "Be still, Lucinda. No one must know." The sound wasn't angry. It was pleading, trembling, like a confession to a reflection. I woke with my heart hammering. The sheets smelled faintly of iron and lilac. For a few seconds, I didn't know where I was. In my apartment or her house? In my body or hers? The clock read 3017 a.m. Outside, the city was silent except for a freight train somewhere far off, dragging its sorrow through the dark. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to steady my breathing. My gloves were still on the nightstand, folded neatly. I slipped one on without thinking, as if bare hands were suddenly dangerous. In the dim light, the white fabric glowed against my skin. Maybe it was just exhaustion, I told myself. A restorer's mind can blur lines between past and present, subject and observer. You stare too long at someone else's life, and eventually it starts staring back. But another voice inside me, the one that sounded like my mother, whispered something different. When the same image returns twice, "Child, it's not memory. It's warning." I turned the glove over in my lap. There was a tiny tear along the seam near the thumb, a black thread poking through like blood beneath gauze. I couldn't tell if it had been there before. I lay back down, but the image of that photograph kept floating behind my eyelids. The woman's arms, the baby's pale cheek pressed to her shoulder, the incomplete name. Lou. I thought about the way her eyes looked directly into the lens, unflinching. It wasn't the look of a servant. It was the look of someone daring history to write her out. And somehow, she had reached me, through glass, through decades, to remind me that the truth was still developing, waiting to be pulled from the tray. When the restoration was finally finished, the museum announced a grand exhibition. White Legacy, Portraits of the Southern Aristocracy. The title itself tasted like chalk. Still, I smiled through the meetings, nodded when the curator praised my work. He said I had handled the Hartwell album with exquisite sensitivity. If only he knew. The opening night was held in the main hall. High ceilings, crystal lights, champagne on silver trays. The air smelled of perfume and old money. Everyone was dressed in white and cream, as if the past itself had a dress code. I stood near the stage, hands clasped behind my back, my white gloves spotless. The walls around me shimmered with enlarged prints, the Hartwell ancestors frozen in their perfect sepia eternity. Then, I saw it. The photograph. A black woman holding a pale infant. It hung near the entrance, printed large enough to see every fold of fabric, every line on the woman's hand. Underneath the frame, the label read, "Unidentified servant with the newborn Evelyn Hartwell." My throat closed. The room tilted slightly. I could feel the pulse in my temples, the sound of my heartbeat louder than the clinking glasses. For a second, I thought maybe no one else noticed it, just another old image, another anonymous shadow propping up history. But I did. I saw everything, the scarf on her head, the curve of her jaw, the tiny mole on her left cheek. It was my mother. The world narrowed to that frame. The white baby glowing like a small moon, and the dark arms that had carried her out of the shadows. Someone called my name. "Lucinda, you're up next." The curator smiled, gesturing toward the stage. My legs moved before I could think. The floor beneath me felt unsteady, like walking on wet negatives. I climbed the steps, the microphone waiting like a question. Dozens of faces turned toward me. Pale, expectant, polite. I began with the speech they'd written for me. Preserving history requires care, patience, and respect. But the words curdled in my mouth. I could feel the picture burning behind me, like a confession I hadn't meant to give. I looked at the crowd, then at the photograph again. And something inside me, something I'd kept buried under layers of civility and chemical fumes, snapped. I leaned closer to the microphone. My voice came out low but steady. "That woman in the photograph," I said, "is not a servant. She is Evelyn Hartwell's mother." The room fell silent. Even the air seemed to stop moving. A few people shifted uncomfortably, the sound of fabric scraping against chairs. The curator's smile froze. Then an older white man. Tall, sharp suit, jaw like carved stone, shot to his feet near the front row. His voice cracked the silence. "That's a damn lie," he shouted. "Don't you dare drag our name through your filthy imagination." He was shaking with rage, but it wasn't just anger I saw. It was fear. The museum director tried to laugh it off, saying, "Let's stay on topic, folks." But the tension was already alive, crawling across the room like static. I felt my hands trembling inside the gloves. I set the microphone down carefully, the small thud echoing louder than any applause ever could. Then I stepped off the stage. Nobody stopped me. The crowd parted the way water parts around a sinking stone. As I walked through the hallway toward the exit, the photographs seemed to stare after me. Those perfect faces, polished and preserved, all built on bones they'd never named. Outside, the night air hit me like ice. My reflection caught in the museum glass. Black suit, white gloves, the only living exhibit that didn't belong. I ripped the gloves off. Underneath, my hands were slick with sweat, streaked with the faint gray dust of silver nitrate. It looked like I'd been handling ashes. I thought about my mother. Her laugh, her silence, the way she'd once said, "Light leaves a mark too." Maybe this was what she meant. That you can scrub and polish and bleach a story until it shines, but it still knows where it came from. I didn't go back inside. The curator called after me once, maybe twice, but I kept walking down the marble steps into the street. The city hummed like a broken record. Streetcars, jazz spilling from bars, the low hum of life that didn't care about history's small cruelties. Each breath felt raw, like I'd swallowed chemicals. That night, I couldn't sleep. When I closed my eyes, I saw the photograph again. My mother's arms, the baby's face, the label beneath them. Unidentified servant. They had erased her name and, by extension, mine. I got up, went to the sink, and turned on the tap. The water came out clear, then cloudy, then clear again. I cupped some in my palms and splashed my face. It stung. My whole life, I'd been washing other people's pasts. Tonight, it felt like they were finally washing me. The museum lights were still visible across the street, bright and cold. Inside that building, my mother's photograph was glowing under glass. Nameless, clean, untouchable. But I knew the truth now. And truth, once seen, doesn't fade. That night, I didn't turn on the lights. The apartment smelled faintly of developer and sweat, the ghosts of 1,000 photographs still clinging to the air. I sat at my desk with the box of Hartwell documents in front of me. The same box I'd carried home from the museum before they could ask for it back. The lid stuck for a moment, the cardboard softened by humidity. When it finally gave, I found a smaller envelope tucked inside, sealed with a piece of brittle tape. My name was written on it in handwriting I hadn't seen in 20 years. Mama's. The ink had faded to the color of weak tea, but her letters were steady. She always wrote like she was sewing words to the page. If you are reading this, the letter began, it means you have already seen what they tried to hide. Don't run from it, Lucy. A lie can survive a century, but truth only needs one witness to start breathing again. Further down, the line that made my chest seize, live under your own name, the one they made me erase. The paper trembled in my hands. I could almost hear her voice. The soft rasp of it when she was tired, the way she said my name like it was both apology and promise. I folded the letter back carefully and set it beside the pile of documents. Birth certificates. Invoices. Restoration notes with my own handwriting on them. Little acts of obedience. Each sheet felt heavier than the last. I went into the kitchen, opened the drawer where I kept my cleaning rags, and pulled out my white gloves. They were still damp from the night before, spotted with gray where sweat had mixed with silver dust. I stared at them for a long time. They'd been my badge of safety, my disguise, my permission slip to touch other people's truth without leaving marks. Then, without fully deciding, I tore them down the middle. The sound was small but final, like a photograph ripping in half. I dropped the pieces into the sink and turned on the hot water. Steam rose instantly, curling like breath. The gloves writhed in the current, twisting pale and thin. The white dye began to bleed out, swirling down the drain in cloudy ribbons until the fabric turned a dull, sick gray. It looked, for a moment, like the color was running off my own hands. I don't know how long I stood there, watching the water. Long enough for my reflection in the window above the sink to blur into the night. When I finally spoke, my voice startled me. "No more washing other people's pasts," I said aloud. From now on, I developed the faces they erased. The words felt clumsy at first, but they fit somewhere deep inside, like a lens snapping into focus. I dried my hands, went back to the desk, and pulled out the first Hartwell photo I had ever restored. The one of the black woman and the baby. For years I had thought of it as a technical triumph. Perfect contrast, delicate toning, no visible repairs. Now I saw it for what it was, a crime scene. I took a marker and wrote on the back, in black ink that bled through slightly. Not unidentified. Then I wrote her full name beneath it, my mother's name, as I remembered it from the letterhead of her old church donation receipts, Lucinda Marrow Sr. I pressed so hard the tip of the pen tore the paper. At midnight, my phone buzzed. The curator. I let it ring. He left a message. "Lucinda, we need to clarify the statement you made tonight. The donors are furious. We can fix this, but we need you to cooperate." Fix this. That phrase twisted in my gut. I had spent a lifetime fixing things. Torn edges, faded faces, cracked glass. Everything except the story itself. I deleted the message without listening to the rest. Then I opened my laptop and typed a new note to myself. The title in bold. Project Hidden Mothers. Beneath it, I wrote, "A photographic restoration of women erased from family archives. No permissions required. No disguises allowed." I didn't know if anyone would ever fund it, or if I'd even have a job after tomorrow. But the idea felt alive, humming under my skin like light trapped behind film. Sometime after 2 a.m., exhaustion caught up to me. I lay down on the couch, still in my work clothes. Outside, rain started, soft at first, then harder, until it filled the room with a steady hiss. The city blurred through the wet window, streetlights stretching into golden threads. I closed my eyes and saw my mother again, holding that baby. But this time, she wasn't behind glass. She was standing right in front of me, her scarf loosened, her skin glowing under the red light of the dark room. She smiled. "Now you see," she said. "Now you develop yourself." I reached out and woke up with the first gray of morning pressing against the curtains. The air smelled clean, like the world had just been rinsed. I sat up slowly. My gloves were gone, my hands bare. The sink was empty, but the drain was ringed with faint white residue, like chalk dust, proof that something had been erased, or born. That day, I called the museum. When the curator answered, I told him simply, "I'm resigning." He started to protest, but I cut him off. "I've spent my whole career restoring what others deemed worthy," I said. "Now I want to restore what they forgot." There was a long pause. Finally, he said, "You'll ruin your reputation, Lucinda." I smiled, even though he couldn't see it. "Maybe. But at least it'll be mine," and I hung up. That was the moment the story changed direction. Not suddenly, but with the quiet click of a shutter closing. The light had chosen me once. This time, I was choosing it back. The story spread faster than I imagined. By morning, the local paper ran the headline, "Museum Employee Disrupts. White Legacy Opening." They made it sound like I had thrown paint on the walls instead of words into the air. By noon, the museum issued a statement. "Ms. Lucinda Marrow has been placed on indefinite suspension pending review." No one said my name on the record, but it was there, between every line. My inbox filled with messages I didn't want to open. Some were polite condemnations, academic colleagues reminding me of professional conduct. Some were worse, anonymous threats wrapped in nostalgia for the good old days. The loudest sound, though, was the silence from people I had once called friends. My white coworkers, the ones who used to praise my delicate touch, stopped answering calls. I passed two of them at a cafe near the museum. They looked right through me, like I was a reflection they didn't recognize. 3 days later, a journalist showed up at my door. A young black woman, neat notebook, sharp eyes. She said she wrote for an independent paper, wanted to amplify my story. At first, I was relieved, someone who might understand. But as she talked, I felt the shape of another trap forming. She kept saying, symbol, movement, representation. Every word built a new cage. When I told her I wasn't interested in politics, just truth, she frowned. "Truth is political," she said, closing her notebook. Maybe she was right. But I didn't want to be the slogan printed under someone else's headline. I'd spent enough time being captioned wrong. After she left, the apartment felt smaller. The phone kept ringing, reporters, activists, the museum's PR office. But I let them all slide into voicemail. The answering machine blinked like a heartbeat I didn't trust. I stayed off social media. Instead, I cleaned. I wiped every surface until my palms stung, as if I could polish away the noise. But the quiet that followed wasn't peace. It was pressure, thick and heavy, pressing against the windows. Each night, I dreamed of the photograph again. Sometimes the baby cried. Sometimes the woman holding her turned to me and whispered words I couldn't catch. Each time I woke, my mouth tasted of metal. On the 5th night, the power went out for an hour. The city outside was just rain and sirens. I lit a candle and sat at my desk, the flame trembling whenever the wind slipped through the cracked window frame. I told myself I was done digging, that I'd done enough damage, said enough truth. But even in the dark, I could feel the Hartwell box under the bed, its presence humming, alive. At 11:47 p.m., the computer pinged. A new email. No sender's name, just an address of random letters. Subject: "If you want to know who Evelyn really is." My pulse jumped. I hesitated, half certain it was another threat. But curiosity has its own gravity. I clicked. There was no body text, only a single sentence. "Meet me at St. Mary's Cemetery, midnight." And below it, one attachment. A photograph of the same Hartwell house by the lake, but overgrown, broken windows, ivy crawling up the porch rail. In the upper corner, scrawled in handwriting that looked almost feminine, "She's waiting." I stared at the screen until the candle guttered out. The room filled with the smell of wax and fear. I checked the clock. 11:53. Outside, thunder rolled over the river. Common sense told me to delete it, to lock the doors, to let the ghosts rest. But something stronger, something I couldn't name, pulled at me. Maybe it was my mother's voice again, soft but firm. Light always chooses the ones who look back. I grabbed my coat, slipped the letter from her envelope into my pocket, and stepped into the rain. The streetlights flickered as I walked toward the car, the wet pavement reflecting me in fragments, headless, doubled, erased. By the time I turned the key in the ignition, it was midnight, and I was already halfway to St. J. Mary's. The iron gate of St. Mary's Cemetery groaned as I pushed it open. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled of metal and wet stone. Moonlight pooled across the marble angels, turning their faces ghost white. I followed the gravel path toward the old Hartwell plot. My shoes crushed the small shells scattered in the dirt, someone's idea of keeping spirits away. She was already there. A woman stood by a cracked mausoleum, wrapped in a pale trench coat that glimmered like bone under the moon. Evelyn Hartwell. Even in the half-light I could see the resemblance to the photographs I'd restored. The same proud jawline, the same eyes that looked like they'd never had to ask permission for anything. She turned when she heard my steps. "Mrs. Marrow," she said evenly, as if greeting a tradeswoman late for an appointment. Her voice carried that practiced calm of people who've always been obeyed. "I know who you are," she added. "My mother used to speak of you. Said you were just the woman who brought me into the world." I stopped a few feet away. The candles left by mourners flickered between us, their flames bending in the wind. "And you," I said, "are the woman who's been living the life that was meant to be mine." A muscle twitched in her cheek. "Don't romanticize it. You think being a Hartwell was some fairy tale? I've spent a lifetime keeping this family's name clean. You wouldn't have survived a year under its weight." "Maybe," I said, "but at least it would have been honest weight." She reached into her coat and pulled out a thin folder, wrapped in plastic to keep the pages dry. "This," she said, holding it out, "is my mother's will." The moonlight caught on the cellophane as she handed it to me. I didn't take it at first. She flipped it open herself, showing me the signature at the bottom. Lucinda M. And then the white streaks of correction fluid smeared across it. "All of this," she said quietly, tapping the document, "was once in your mother's name. The house, the lake property, the trust. Then someone decided that didn't look right on paper. So they fixed it." The word "fixed" landed between us like a blade. I looked up. "And you've lived off it ever since." Her eyes flashed. "I was a baby. I didn't choose this." "No," I said, "but you profited from it." Evelyn closed the folder, her expression tightening. "If I release this, my entire family's reputation will collapse. Decades of history. Gone. You think that helps anyone?" "It helps the truth," I said. She gave a short, brittle laugh. "You sound just like her." "Like who?" "Your mother." The name hung there heavier than the damp air. "She used to hum when she worked," Evelyn continued. "The same hymn every morning. My mother told me she found it comforting until the day she didn't. Said she couldn't stand the sound anymore." I felt my stomach turn, because it reminded her the child wasn't hers. Evelyn's silence confirmed it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was water dripping from the trees. Then I said, "You came here because you wanted to be absolved. You want me to say it's not your fault." She met my gaze. "Isn't it?" I shook my head. "You can't repent for what you never confessed." Her hand tightened on the folder. "You think exposing this will make you whole? It'll just make you a scandal. The world doesn't reward women like us for telling the truth. Then maybe the world needs to be embarrassed." Something flickered across her face, anger, or maybe recognition. She stepped closer, the heels of her shoes crunching on gravel. "You have no idea what I've sacrificed to keep my family standing," she said. "My husband, my children, they carry this name. You tear it down, you tear them down too." I could smell her perfume, white peony, the same scent that haunted my dreams. I leaned in. "Maybe that's justice. Let the stains show through the polish." The slap came so fast I didn't see it. The sound cracked through the cemetery, startling a flock of crows from the trees. My cheek burned. I didn't move. "You don't get to rewrite my life," she hissed. I tasted iron in my mouth and whispered, "No." I'm rewriting mine. I turned away, and as I did, something metallic clinked on the ground. Evelyn gasped softly and reached for her pocket. A small silver key had fallen from her coat, catching the moonlight like a drop of mercury. I bent down and picked it up before she could. The engraving was faint but visible. L.M. Her eyes widened. Give that back. What does it open? I asked. Nothing that concerns you. But the tremor in her voice betrayed her. I turned the key over in my hand, feeling its weight. It concerns me if it carries my initials. That's not yours, she snapped. It belonged to her. To your mother. My mother kept it. Why? Evelyn hesitated, then said, There's a trunk in the old Hartwell house. Basement level. Locked for decades. She said it held private correspondence. Things better left buried. She reached for the key again, but I closed my fist around it. You've had a lifetime of things left buried, I said. Maybe it's time to dig. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. The wind hissed through the pines like film running off a reel. Finally, Evelyn whispered, You think uncovering the past will make you free? It won't. It'll make you responsible for it. Maybe freedom is just another word for responsibility, I said. Her eyes softened for the first time. You really are her daughter. Then she turned and walked away, her coat brushing the wet grass. I stood there until the sound of her footsteps disappeared into the dark. I looked down at the key again. It felt warm, as if it had been waiting for my hand. Behind me, the marble angels gleamed pale and watchful. I thought of all the photographs I'd restored, faces trapped under varnish, waiting for light. The moon slipped out from behind a cloud, silver washing the cemetery in cold clarity. I whispered to no one. Every lock has its truth. Every truth has its price. Then I slipped the key into my pocket and started toward the gate. At the exit, I turned once more. Evelyn was gone, but the folder lay on the ground where she dropped it. The pages were soaked, ink bleeding across the signatures. I crouched and picked it up. The white correction fluid was dissolving in the rain, revealing faint black letters underneath my mother's name, slowly resurfacing like something refusing to stay dead. I smiled through tears I didn't notice until they fell. It's washing clean, I murmured. Just the way it should. I left the will where it lay, the pages flapping in the wind, and walked out into the night, one hand in my pocket, the silver key pressing warm against my palm. Somewhere behind me, thunder rumbled again, distant but certain. The storm hadn't ended, it had just begun. By morning, the headlines had already chosen their villain. Museum restorer forges documents, defaces Southern heritage. My name sat in bold underneath, as though I were a criminal instead of a conservator. I turned off the television, but the words stayed, reflected in every shiny surface of my apartment. The windows, the sink, even the blank screen of my computer. By noon, I received an official letter from the museum board. Effective immediately. Your contract is terminated due to misconduct and reputational damage. No one called. Not the curator. Not the colleagues I'd shared lunch with for 10 years. Silence. Clean as bleach. It didn't take long to discover who had started the fire. The online article quoted Evelyn Hartwell, identified as a descendant of the historical Hartwell family and patron of the museum. She had provided authenticated copies of documents proving that I had fabricated the will and forged the signature of her mother. I stared at the photograph that accompanied the story. Evelyn in her pristine white suit, standing before the same photograph of my mother, smiling faintly. The caption read, Mrs. Hartwell defends family honor after vicious attack. I could almost hear her voice beneath the print. Don't you dare drag our name through your filthy imagination. I packed the studio slowly. Every drawer was filled with the ghosts of my own making, restored portraits, cracked negatives, pieces of lives I had polished until they gleamed like lies. I wrapped my cameras in brown paper and labeled the boxes by hand. In the corner of the work table sat the silver key. Small, elegant, deceptively innocent. Its engraving, LM, caught the light when I passed. That was all I kept. The rest I left for the museum to reclaim. As I locked the door for the last time, The smell of fixer and dust clung to me like a second skin. I didn't look back. For 2 days I tried to convince myself to stay still, to wait for the chaos to settle. But truth doesn't sleep. It scratches at the walls of your mind until you answer. Evelyn had told me the key belonged to my mother, that it opened a trunk in the basement of the old Hartwell house. Private correspondence, she'd said. I knew a lie when I heard one. No one spends their life guarding a box of letters. People only guard what could burn them. The Hartwell mansion sat 20 miles out, past the river and the sugarcane fields. Once a showpiece of the Old South, now it was little more than a husk. The paint peeled like sunburn, the roof sagged, ivy crawling through the cracks. The museum had restored the facade for photographs, but never bothered to fix the inside. When I arrived that evening, the gate hung half open, rusted through. The air was heavy with the smell of magnolia and rot. I parked at the edge of the overgrown drive and sat for a moment, engine off, listening. Cicadas. Wind. Distant thunder. Then I stepped out, clutching the key in my palm. Inside, the house was a mausoleum. Dust sheets covered the furniture. Portraits stared from the walls with eyes dulled by neglect. I recognized faces I'd once restored. The same thin lips, the same arrogance frozen into oil and canvas. I moved through the hall with a flashlight, past the grand staircase, until I found the door leading to the basement. The handle resisted, swollen by years of humidity. When it finally gave, the smell hit me. Mildew, iron, and something faintly sweet, like decayed flowers. I descended slowly, my footsteps echoing off concrete. The beam of my light cut through the dark, finding shelves lined with boxes and jars of chemicals, a few broken frames, and, in the far corner, a trunk. It was old but beautiful, its hinges ornate, the lock a perfect match for the key I held. I knelt down. My hand shook as I slid the key into the hole. It turned easily, as if it had been waiting. The lid creaked open. Inside were stacks of photographs, carefully bundled in faded silk. Beneath them, letters tied with ribbon, their edges brittle with age. I lifted one bundle and laid it on the floor. The top photograph was of my mother, not as a maid, as a woman, young, radiant, dressed in plain clothes but standing tall beside a man I didn't recognize. Behind them, the Hartwell mansion, newly painted, the same house I was standing in now. I flipped through the others, her holding a newborn, smiling. Then, a photograph of her and the older Mrs. Stead, Hartwell. The resemblance between them unmistakable. They weren't mistress and servant. They were sisters. My throat closed. The letters confirmed it. My mother, Lucinda Marrow, had been the illegitimate daughter of the first Hartwell patriarch and a woman the family never acknowledged. Evelyn's mother had known. Everyone had known. The entire history of the Hartwell legacy was built on a lie, a line of inheritance stolen by skin color. My hands shook as I sorted through the papers. Near the bottom, I found a smaller envelope sealed with wax. On it, written in my mother's handwriting, "For my child, when the light finds her." Inside was a photograph I'd never seen. My mother holding 2 infants. One dark, one pale. The back read, "Born together. Divided by ink." I sat on the cold floor, the image trembling in my hands. It explained everything, the dreams, the connection, the impossible mirror between Evelyn and me, twins. One erased from the record. One crowned in its place. I laughed, a hollow, broken sound that echoed through the basement. Decades of silence cracked open like the roof above me. The world tilted, but for once it made sense. I gathered the letters and photographs into a plastic bag and climbed back upstairs, the key warm against my skin. Outside, lightning flashed across the fields, illuminating the crumbling porch. The storm was moving in fast. I got into the car and sat there shaking, half from cold, half from fury. Evelyn hadn't just stolen a life. She had rewritten an entire bloodline. Mine. And now, to protect her fiction, she had turned me into a fraud. The next morning, my story was everywhere. Online news, radio, local TV, all repeating Evelyn's version of the truth. Reporters called me a liar, a manipulator, a bitter woman inventing racial revenge. They used the same photograph of me on every platform. A cropped image from the museum website, my face shadowed, my eyes mid-blink. Even my own image was twisted against me. I shut the laptop and whispered, "Enough." If Evelyn wanted to fight in public, she would get her wish. But I wouldn't fight with words. I would fight with evidence, the kind that couldn't be denied. The photographs, the letters, the trunk itself. That was her family's tomb, and I held the map. For the next few days I planned. I rented a small workspace from an old friend who still believed me. Nadine, a retired photographer with a sense of humor sharp enough to cut glass. "You're not going to tell me this is legal, are you?" she said when I showed her the trunk. "No," I replied, "but it's true." She grinned. "Then let's develop some ghosts." Together we cleaned, scanned, and enlarged the photographs, restoring each one carefully. The images were fragile, but they were alive. Proof that history had a pulse. With every print that appeared in the tray, I felt something inside me settle. Not peace, but purpose. The faces looked back at me now, no longer begging to be remembered, but ready to testify. When I finished, I placed the silver key in the center of the table and stared at it. It wasn't just a tool anymore. It was a weapon. Small, quiet, unstoppable. Evelyn thought she had buried the truth deep enough that even time would forget. But light has a way of finding cracks, and I had learned long ago how to let the light in. The rain returned that night, hammering the roof in steady rhythm. I sat by the window, watching the lightning flash over the river. Tomorrow, I decided, I would go public, on my own terms. No newspapers, no interviews, just photographs. An exhibition called The Hidden Line. No speeches, no politics, no commentary, just images speaking in the language of proof. I thought of my mother's letter again. A lie can live a century, but truth only needs one witness. I would be that witness. I picked up the silver key one last time, traced the initials with my thumb, and whispered to the empty room, "I'm done unlocking doors for other people. This one's mine." That night the storm returned, rolling over the city like a slow drum. I couldn't sleep. The air in my apartment felt too still, too clean, like a photograph before exposure. By midnight I was back on the road, the silver key in my pocket, the trunk of evidence locked in the car. I told myself I was only going to check one thing, to see if the basement held more proof. But the truth was simpler. I needed to face the house while it still existed, before someone else erased it again. The Hartwell mansion waited in the dark, its windows glowing faintly from the lightning that tore across the sky. The gate was chained now, freshly padlocked. I cut through the hedge instead, branches scratching my arms as if warning me back. Inside, the hallway smelled of mold and memory. The portraits on the wall seemed to follow me, their painted eyes dull with fatigue. Water dripped from the ceiling in slow, rhythmic taps. I moved through the familiar silence until I reached the basement door. The one Evelyn hadn't mentioned. The handle was stiff, but the key turned easily. The hinges shrieked as I pushed it open. The air inside was thick, almost sweet with rot. My flashlight beam shook as I descended, dust spiraling through the light like tiny ghosts. At the bottom was another room, smaller, sealed by a steel gate. On the wall beside it hung a rusted sign. "Dark room. Authorized staff only." The smell hit me first. Vinegar. Fixer. The sour ghost of chemicals long dried. I slipped the key into the second lock. It turned again, smoother this time, as if it recognized my touch. The door opened onto a hidden chamber, what used to be a photographic archive. Shelves lined every wall, stacked with canisters, negatives, glass plates. And in the center, a wooden table covered with photographs. Not museum prints. Personal ones. I stepped closer, the beam trembling over the images. My mother. Dozens of pictures of her, some pristine, most mutilated. Her face slashed, burned, torn in half. One photograph had been stabbed through the eyes. Another was only her hands, folded in her lap, as if someone had tried to erase her body but couldn't bear to destroy the gesture. The smell of smoke lingered faintly, even after decades. I picked up a half-charred photo. It showed her standing by the lake, pregnant, the outline of her belly soft against the light. Someone had burned the lower half where the child might have been. My stomach clenched. I kept digging. There were contact sheets, negatives labeled in neat handwriting. E.H. Birth, June 1950. Every frame had been cut in half. Every half missing the same thing. Her. At the bottom of the pile was one photograph still intact. My flashlight caught it, and for a moment I forgot to breathe. It was the image I'd been restoring all along, but larger, clearer. My mother, young, holding a newborn Evelyn, staring straight into the camera. No servitude in her stance, no shame. Just a woman claiming the life she made. The eyes in the picture seemed to look directly through the years, into me. I turned it over. On the back, in my mother's handwriting, were the words, "For the child they said I could never keep." The flashlight slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor, beam spinning wildly around the room. For a second, the shadows danced like fire. I dropped to my knees. The tears came fast, hot, unstoppable. All my life I'd been careful with moisture humidity ruins film, tears warp the paper. But tonight I didn't care. I held the photograph to my chest and sobbed. My mother had spoken to me through chemicals, through silver, through the language of light itself. She had hidden the truth where only someone like me could find it, inside the process of seeing. "Mama," I whispered into the dark, "I see it now. I see everything." The words echoed off the concrete, then vanished. The rain outside softened, as if the world had exhaled with me. When I finally stood, my knees were numb. I gathered every surviving photo into a canvas bag, careful not to separate them again. The broken ones, the burned ones, I took them all. On the far wall hung a mirror, its surface clouded with dust. I wiped it with my sleeve and stared. My face appeared beside hers in the photograph I held. Same cheekbones, same shadow around the eyes. For the first time, I didn't feel like a restorer or a thief. I felt like a daughter meeting her mother in the one place they both belonged. The dark room. I turned off the flashlight and stood still. Even without light, I could sense the outlines of everything. Shelves, walls, the table where the truth had waited. I whispered again, softer this time. "You hid it here so I could find it, didn't you?" Somewhere behind me, a drop of water fell into a tin pan with a soft plink, like the click of a shutter. I smiled through my tears. "It's all right now, Mama," I said. "I'll develop it right this time." I took one last look at the room before climbing the stairs. The key in my pocket felt lighter, almost weightless. When I opened the basement door, the storm had passed. The air was damp and new. Outside, the moon had broken free of the clouds, spilling its pale light across the field. I stepped onto the porch and looked back at the house, its windows glowing faintly, like old negatives finally catching light. The world felt still, as if it too were holding its breath for what came next. I tucked the photograph into my coat, close to my heart. The paper was still damp with my tears, but I didn't mind. Maybe it needed that moisture like a film bath to bring the image fully alive. "Mama," I whispered one last time, "your face won't disappear again. I promise." Then I walked down the drive, the bag of photos heavy on my shoulder, the key glinting in my hand, the dawn beginning to rise behind me. For weeks I did nothing but work. No television, no news, no sleep that lasted more than a few hours. I took the photographs I had rescued from the Hartwell basement and began restoring them in secret, using the same skills that had once made me respectable: the precision, the patience, the invisible hand. But this time, I didn't hide the seams. I let the burns show. I left the torn edges raw, the smoke stains intact. Every scar was part of the story. I spent my savings renting a small warehouse space near the Riverbear walls. Leaking roof. Perfect. There was something honest about the roughness. Nothing here pretended to be polished. I called a few young Black artists I'd mentored years ago. Painters, photographers, poets, and told them I wanted to build something together. When they arrived, I spread the photographs across the concrete floor. They knelt around them like worshippers at an altar. A girl with green braids whispered, "Who took these?" "My mother," I said, "and the people who tried to erase her." They looked up at me, waiting for instruction. Instead, I handed them gloves. "Help me give them back their faces," I said. For the next several nights, we worked until dawn. Someone played Nina Simone on a small speaker, the notes filling the air like a slow heartbeat. We printed, enlarged, restitched the ruined images onto cloth and glass, layering them until they shimmered between presence and absence. The project took form almost on its own: the hidden mothers. The concept was simple but radical: portraits of Black women who had been erased from American family albums, their names cut out, their faces blurred behind the children they raised. My mother would stand at the center. Her photograph, the one I had found intact, would hang alone on a clean white wall. No caption, no history lesson, just a single line beneath it: "Portrait of the woman who raised the one who later denied her." The others gathered around it, forming a constellation of forgotten faces: mothers, caretakers, invisible architects of lives not their own. When the young artists asked if I planned to name Evelyn Hartwell, I shook my head. "This isn't about revenge," I said. "It's about seeing what's already there." They nodded, though I could see the hunger in their eyes. For confrontation, for spectacle. But I had learned something Evelyn never did: the loudest truths don't need to shout. So I built silence into the exhibition. White walls, soft light. Enough space for each image to breathe. I wanted the audience to feel what I had felt in that dark room. The shock of recognition. The weight of what had been hidden in plain sight. While we worked, the outside world continued its noise. Evelyn's lawyers sent cease and desist letters to galleries rumored to be helping me. I ignored them. The museum issued another statement: "Ms. Marrow's claims have been thoroughly discredited." I ignored that too. Let them build their wall of lies. I was building something that could outlast paper. One night, Nadine came by the warehouse carrying 2 flasks of coffee. She watched me mount the final print. "My mother's onto its frame. You know this could destroy her," Nadine said. "I'm not destroying anything," I replied. "I'm developing." She smiled softly. Same thing, in the right light. The night before the opening, I walked through the space alone. Every photograph was lit, humming quietly in the still air. The room smelled faintly of fixer and paint. I ran my fingers along the edge of my mother's frame. Her eyes met mine, calm and unyielding. All the questions I'd carried my whole life. Who was I? Where did I come from? Why did the light hurt? Found their answer in that gaze. I whispered, "Tomorrow they'll see you, Mama. All of you." Outside, thunder rumbled again, low and steady. The same storm, circling back, waiting for the right exposure. When dawn came, the city glowed pale gold over the river. The artists arrived one by one, their laughter echoing through the warehouse. We cleaned the floors, arranged chairs, printed invitations by hand. On each card we stamped the same title: "The Hidden Mothers." An exhibition by Lucinda Marrow and Collective. At the bottom, a single line in italics: "For those whose faces were never meant to be remembered." We didn't advertise beyond that. No sponsors, no speeches, just an open door. That evening, as the sun fell, people began to arrive: artists, neighbors, strangers, even a few museum staff who came quietly, avoiding my eye. The space filled with the hush that comes before revelation. I stood by the back wall, watching as they moved from photo to photo. Some lingered, some cried. One woman touched the frame of my mother's portrait and whispered, "She looks like my grandmother." In that moment, I realized I didn't need to speak for her anymore. The image had found its own voice. When the last visitor left, the young artists and I stood together in the middle of the room. Nadine raised her cup of coffee. "To the mothers," she said. We echoed her softly, "To the mothers." I turned off the main lights, leaving only the center lamp over my mother's portrait. Her face glowed in the dark, surrounded by silence. The silver key hung from a nail just beneath the frame. catching the reflection of her eyes. I stepped closer and whispered, "It's open now, Mama. No one can lock it again." The night of the opening arrived like a storm that had been holding its breath. By 7 o'clock, the warehouse was already full. Artists, critics, students, neighbors, and reporters packed shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with perfume, camera flashes, and expectation. Someone had whispered that The Hidden Mothers was the exhibition the museum tried to bury, and that rumor spread faster than any official invitation. The space glowed under soft white lights. The photographs shimmered along the walls like windows into another century. Women who had once been cropped out of family portraits now reclaimed their ground, their gaze steady, unflinching. In the center, my mother's image towered above them all, a massive projection against the main wall. She held the infant Evelyn in her arms, the light tracing the curve of her face, the strength in her grip. Her eyes looked out over the crowd, calm and defiant, as though she had been waiting 70 years for this moment. The hum of conversation dimmed when the projector flickered again. A second image appeared beside the photograph. The original birth certificate. Name of child: Evelyn Hartwell. Mother: Lucinda Marrow. The room froze. At first there was only silence, the kind that feels alive, like the air itself is deciding what to believe. Then came the first whisper, a gasp, the rustle of paper as someone took notes too loudly. I stood near the back, hands folded, watching the light spill across their faces. Some looked stunned, some angry, some moved in a way they didn't understand. And then she appeared. Evelyn Hartwell. She walked in flanked by two men in suits, her lawyers, probably, her expression pale and tight. The crowd parted for her without a word. She stopped at the foot of the projection, staring up at her own infant face in my mother's arms. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then she turned toward me. "What do you want?" she said, her voice steady but fraying at the edges. "Money? An apology? What?" I shook my head. "Nothing. I just want every child to know who brought them into the world." The words carried easily through the quiet. Someone in the audience, a woman around Evelyn's age, white, with tear-streaked cheeks, whispered, "God." Another murmured, "It's her mother." The room pulsed with tension, fragile as glass. A reporter raised his hand, hesitant but drawn by instinct. "Ms. Marrow," he said, "do you regret making this public? Knowing how many lives this could disrupt?" I met his eyes. "I didn't make anything public," I said. "I just developed the photograph correctly this time." A few people laughed nervously, unsure if they were allowed to. Others nodded, solemn. Evelyn's face turned red. "You think this is justice?" she hissed. "You think humiliating me in front of strangers fixes anything?" I took a slow breath. "No. But pretending it never happened breaks everything." One of the lawyers stepped forward. "Ms. Marrow, this exhibition contains stolen property and fabricated documents. You are in serious violation of—" He didn't finish. The young artist with the green braids stepped up beside me and said clearly, "All images on display were obtained legally from abandoned archives. The letters and photographs you're referring to were found in a public building slated for demolition. We have the permits." The crowd stirred, whispers rising like wind through leaves. Evelyn turned toward the projection again. Her reflection appeared faintly on the wall beside my mother's face. For the first time, she looked small. I stepped forward, voice low but firm. "Your family spent generations painting over their own blood," I said. "But light doesn't forget. Every time you covered it, it only waited for another exposure." She looked at me, eyes glossy. "You sound just like her," she whispered. "Maybe I am her," I said. The projector changed slides. More photographs, one after another. Women holding children not their own. Letters signed. For the child they said I could never keep. A mosaic of erased histories. The audience stood silent as the images rolled by, each one cutting deeper than any speech could. Every face, every burn mark, every fingerprint of smoke told a truth older than any surname. By the time the final slide appeared, my mother's handwriting across the image. She developed the truth. There were tears in the crowd. Some people clapped, hesitant at first, then louder. It wasn't applause for me. It was for the faces on the walls. Evelyn stayed still through all of it. When the lights came up, she was standing directly beneath the projection, staring at the image of herself as a baby. She whispered something I couldn't hear. Then she turned toward me again. "She loved me," she said quietly, almost to herself. "I can see it in her eyes." I nodded. "Yes. And that's why I can forgive you." She blinked, startled. "Forgive me? I'm not here to destroy your name," I said. "Just to return the part of it that was stolen." Evelyn looked at the photograph one last time, then at the silver key hanging beneath it. "Keep it," she said softly and walked out. No cameras followed her. No reporters dared. The door closed behind her with a sound like an old book finally shutting. After she left, the energy in the room shifted. People approached me, shaking my hand, some whispering, "Thank you." Others saying nothing, just nodding through tears. One woman pressed a folded photo into my palm. "Her great-grandmother," she said, "a nursemaid, unnamed in every record." "Can you restore her too?" she asked. I told her yes. When the crowd finally thinned, I walked to the front of the room. The projector still hummed. The image of my mother fading slightly as the bulb warmed. I stood beneath it, the light falling on my face and hers, merging us for a heartbeat. I whispered to her, "It's done, Mama. They see you now." The air smelled faintly of dust and metal, the scent of truth unsealed. Outside, the rain had stopped. The streetlights cast long reflections across the river. Reporters lingered near their vans, unsure what to write. Nadine came up beside me, slipping her arm through mine. "You know this will be everywhere tomorrow," she said. "Let it," I answered. She smiled. "You realize you've just rewritten history?" "No," I said. "I just corrected its exposure." Back inside, the young artists were packing up equipment. One of them called out, "Miss Marrow, what should we do with the remaining prints?" I looked at the wall, at my mother's face glowing in the dim light. "Let them travel," I said. "Let the truth move for once." When the last of them left, I stayed alone in the gallery. Only one light remained, the soft beam over my mother's portrait. I approached it slowly. Her eyes seemed alive now, the shadows no longer swallowing them. I could almost feel her hand on my shoulder, warm, steady. I took the silver key from the nail and held it in my palm. Its surface was tarnished, but the engraving still shone. L.M. I thought of how many locks it had opened, how many doors it had waited behind. "Thank you," I whispered, "for hiding it long enough for me to find it." Before leaving, I wrote one final line on a small card and placed it beneath her frame. "Every truth waits in the dark until someone dares to switch on the light." Then I turned off the projector. The wall went blank, but her presence lingered. A quiet after-image, the way light stays on the eye after a flash. I walked to the door and stepped into the night. The city glimmered under the street lamps, wet and new. The storm had broken. The world at last was developing. After the exhibition, I left New Orleans. No announcement, no farewell. One morning I simply packed my negatives, a box of contact sheets, and drove north until the skyline disappeared behind the swamp fog. I found a small wooden house by the river, abandoned for years. The roof leaked, the porch leaned, but it faced east, toward the light. That was all I needed. The first weeks were silence and rain. I slept late, woke to the sound of boats dragging nets through the water. Some nights I dreamed of the gallery crowd, the flashbulbs, the moment Evelyn's face turned white as the projection behind her. But when I opened my eyes, there was only the slow breathing of the river and the smell of pine. I turned one of the back rooms into a dark room again. Old habits returned easily. Mixing chemicals, testing paper, sealing the windows with heavy cloth. But this time, the space felt different. It wasn't a room for hiding, it was a room for listening. On the wall, I hung two things: the burned white glove I had torn apart the night I chose the truth, and the silver key, now dull with age. They dangled side by side, relics of everything I had been, servant, restorer, witness, daughter. I kept no clock inside. The only rhythm was water dripping from the faucet and birds calling through the cracked panes. Each morning, I opened the window and let the light spill directly onto my face. No filters, no red glow. Just sunlight. Unedited, uncorrected. "Mama," I whispered one morning, "I don't dream I'm a white woman anymore. I'm awake now." Sometimes, letters arrived from the city. One from Nadine, a postcard of the river at dawn. She wrote, "The Hidden Mothers is touring. People are still crying in front of your mother's photo." Another came from one of the young artists. "They're calling it the most honest show of the year." I smiled, folded the cards, and slipped them under the edge of the mirror. Praise felt distant, like radio static. What mattered was that the faces kept moving, traveling from wall to wall, finding their witnesses. Evelyn never wrote. But once, a package arrived with no return address, a small envelope inside a silver frame. It was a photograph of her standing at the same gravesite where we'd met, flowers in hand. On the back, one line, "I remember now." I placed it beneath my mother's portrait in the darkroom. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't an act. It's a light that decides, on its own, to stay. Days passed in small rituals. I made coffee thick and sweet. I walked along the riverbank collecting smooth stones. Sometimes I printed new photos from the negatives I'd saved. Not for sale, not for display, just for the joy of seeing something appear out of blankness. In one of them, my own reflection surfaced beside my mother's, faint but certain. I left that print to dry and didn't touch it again. The town nearby was small enough that no one recognized my name. They just called me the picture lady. I fixed their wedding photos, their faded portraits, their torn snapshots. I never charged much. When they thanked me, I said, "The light did most of the work." And every time I said it, I meant it. One evening, while rinsing prints in the tray, I caught sight of the glove and the key on the wall. The glove had stiffened into an odd shape, half open, as if still reaching for something. The key hung motionless beside it, catching a faint glint from the lamp. I realized I no longer needed either. They were proofs of a life already developed. Still, I didn't take them down. They belonged here. Reminders that truth is made with our hands, not our permission. Summer turned to autumn. The river slowed, its surface turning mirror still. At dusk, when the sky reddened, the whole world looked like a giant dark room waiting for an image to appear. Sometimes, I thought I heard my mother's voice in the rustle of reeds, humming the old hymn she used to sing. The same one Evelyn remembered. The song no longer hurt. It sounded like air moving through light. I picked up my camera again. Not the Leica from my student days, but a simple one, plastic and stubborn. I began taking pictures of the river, of fishermen, of children skipping stones. Every photo came out imperfect, overexposed, streaked, flawed, and I loved them all. For the first time, I didn't try to fix a single one. One morning, a young girl from town knocked on my door holding a torn photograph. "Miss Lucinda," she said shyly, "can you fix this?" I looked at the image. A woman and a child, blurred by time, almost erased by a spill of water. I smiled. "Maybe not fix," I said. "But we can let her be seen again." The girl watched as the picture floated in the tray, colors returning slowly, edges breathing back to life. When the face appeared, the child gasped. "That's her," she whispered. "That's my mama." I handed it to her gently. "Then keep her safe," I said. "Don't let the light forget." After she left, I realized I'd just repeated my mother's lesson word for word. That night, the air smelled of rain. I opened the window wider and watched the reflection of moonlight ripple on the river. In its surface, I saw two shapes, mine and hers, overlapping like double exposure. I thought of everything the light had taken from us, and everything it had given back. Maybe they were the same thing. "Mama," I whispered, "we're both in the picture now." I turned off the lamp. The dark room settled into perfect black. Behind my closed eyes, images glowed faintly, not of pain, but of persistence. faces waiting. Stories still developing, and for the first time in a long, long while, I slept without dreaming. A full year passed before I realized I was ready to share light again. The river house had steadied me. Its rhythms had become a kind of heartbeat. Sunrise through the shutters, wind in the reeds, the slow hiss of water against the dock. For months I thought that peace meant disappearance. But peace, I learned, is simply truth. That's done arguing. So when the letter came from a community arts center in Baton Rouge asking if I would teach a course in analog restoration, I didn't hesitate. I wrote back, "Yes, but I'll need a dark room with windows." They thought it was a joke. It wasn't. By spring, the workshop was ready. A converted warehouse again, my favorite kind of cathedral. We named it True Exposure Atelier. The walls smelled of fixer and new paint. The sinks gleamed, the windows faced east. Each workstation held an enlarger, a basin, and a small plaque engraved with the same sentence. She developed the truth. It was my mother's line, carved into silver, mounted above her restored portrait that hung at the front. She looked down at the students like a quiet instructor, stern but tender. The women who came were mostly middle-aged, a few younger, all black or brown, all carrying boxes of photographs that had survived floods, fires, or silence. Some arrived trembling, afraid to even touch their family pictures. Others came with fierce purpose. On the first morning, I told them, "Here we use no filters, no digital tools. We work by hand, the way truth used to travel." They laughed softly. Then we began. I showed them how to mix the chemicals, developer, stop bath, fixer. How to measure by scent and sound as much as by ratio. "Listen for the hiss when the acid touches metal," I said. "It tells you the solution's alive." I taught them patience. How an image appears slowly, like forgiveness. How you must wait for the gray to decide it's ready to become light. Each woman chose one photograph to restore. A grandmother's wedding. A child in uniform. Mother smiling through blur. As they worked, stories spilled out, bits of lineage pieced together the way we pieced torn negatives. One whispered, "I never saw her eyes until now." Another said, "I didn't know my skin could shine like this on paper." I nodded, keeping my hands steady on their prints. "This isn't about fixing the past," I told them. "It's about letting it breathe." News of the atelier spread. Soon the local paper called it a place where lost faces find light. I didn't mind the poetry. For once, words were kind. Donations arrived, rolls of film, old enlargers, black and white stock no one used anymore. We rebuilt everything from fragments. One afternoon, while the students hung their drawing prints, a young reporter came by to take pictures. She asked, "Ms. Marrow, do you still develop photographs for other people?" The class went quiet, waiting for my answer. I smiled. "Of course I do," I said. "But this time I developed them in real light." Laughter rippled through the room, gentle and clean. When the reporter left, I turned to the students. "Let's go outside," I said. "It's time to try something new." We carried a tray of unexposed paper into the sunlight. The air smelled of rain and magnolia. "Lay them down," I told them. "Let the day do the rest." The sun spilled across the white sheets. Slowly, faint outlines began to form faces, hands, glints of movement. No chemicals, no control, just light and time. They gasped as the images emerged. Imperfect, unpredictable, beautiful. "This," I said, "is what truth looks like when it develops itself." That evening, after everyone left, I stayed alone in the studio. The last prints still glowed faintly in the wash tray, the sunlight's afterimage refusing to fade. I took my mother's photograph down from the wall and set it beside it. For a long while I just looked. 2 generations of light, side by side. Her eyes still carried that same calm challenge, as if asking, "What will you do with it now?" So I answered aloud, "I'll keep teaching them how to see you, Mama. That's enough." At night I often walked by the river behind the building. The city lights shimmered on the water like slow-moving film. I'd think about the path that led here, the darkness, the confrontation, the exhibition. Evelyn's letter that simply said, I remember now. Sometimes I still heard my mother's humming in the wind. Other times, the quiet itself felt like her approval. I learned to love that silence. It wasn't emptiness, it was exposure. Months later, the atelier hosted its first group exhibition. The students named it Light Inheritance. No critics, no sponsors, just folding chairs, home-baked food, children running between easels. On every wall hung photographs reborn from damage. Fingerprints still visible, water stains turned to halos. Each print carried a note in the artist's handwriting. She was here. He smiled like this once. We found her again. When the show ended, we gathered for a group picture. I stood in the back, camera in hand, waiting for the timer. Someone shouted, "Ms. Lucinda, you're not in it." I laughed. That's fine, I'm the one taking it. But they insisted. One of them grabbed the camera and said, "Your turn. Come stand with your mothers." So I did. We posed beneath the soft lights, a sea of women holding photographs of women holding photographs. A chain, unbroken at last. The flash went off. For a moment, the room was pure white. Then we were all there, developed together. Later, when the guests were gone and the chairs stacked, I returned to the dark room one final time that night. On the table lay a single unexposed sheet of photo paper, the last of the batch. I took it in my hands, walked outside, and held it up to the dawn. The sky was turning pink over the river. I let the light hit the surface for a long, slow minute. When I placed the sheet back on the tray inside, an image began to rise. Two faces. Mine and hers. Side by side, both smiling. I didn't stop it, didn't fix it, didn't wash it away. I just watched. "There we are," I whispered. Finally in the same frame. The air filled with that clean scent of developer and morning dew. Through the window, the first sunlight spilled across the room, bright enough to drown everything else. I set the photograph on the drying line, stepped back, and let the day flood in. For the first time, I didn't flinch. The light was ours now. The camera is simple. A small analog one, perched on a tripod in the middle of the studio. I turn on the light, check the focus, and step into the frame. Behind me hangs my mother's photograph, silver edges glowing in the afternoon sun. Around it, the room is quiet. Only the soft ticking of the drying prints and the hum of the river beyond the windows. I look straight into the lens. It feels like looking into an eye that already knows the truth. "If one day," I begin, my voice steady but low, "you dream of living inside someone else's skin, don't be afraid. Maybe it isn't a dream at all. Maybe it's the memory of someone finding their way back through you." The words hang in the air like dust motes caught in light. I take a breath, slow and full. For years, I continue, I thought the past was buried under layers of bleach and silence. But light doesn't forget. It waits. And when it returns, it comes through whoever's brave enough to open their eyes. I step closer to the lens, the frame filling with my face. The fine lines around my mouth look softer now. The years don't weigh, they witness. I've learned, I say, that every erased story leaves an afterimage. You can't see it until you look from the right angle, until you stand exactly where the truth once stood. My reflection trembles faintly in the glass. I don't flinch. "This isn't a confession," I tell the camera. "It's an invitation. If you have a picture, a letter, a name that history forgot, bring it to the light. Let it speak again. Share this story. Because somewhere, someone is still missing from their own photograph." I pause, letting the quiet fill the space between us. Outside, a gull cries over the river. One sharp, brief note that feels like agreement. I smile, small but sure. "I used to think restoration meant erasing damage," I say. "Now I know it means showing it, letting the cracks catch the light so others can see the way through." I reach up and adjust the frame behind me, my mother's portrait perfectly centered. Her eyes meet mine in the reflection of the lens. "Tell this story," I say finally. "Tell it for the women who were never named, for the hands that held the camera but were cropped out of the picture, for the faces that smiled from the edges and were cut away. Tell it for them. And for you. I let the silence stand, long enough for it to mean something. Then, quietly, because maybe, somewhere out there, someone is still being erased from their own photograph. I reach toward the switch. The red bulb above the developing tray glows faintly, a remnant of the old darkroom days. For a moment, I remember every night spent under that light, my hands trembling, afraid of what the image might reveal. Not anymore. I turn off the lamp. The room fills with natural light, clean and white, flooding every corner. The silver frame on the wall gleams. The air hums alive. And in that brightness I see everything clearly. The color of my skin, the shape of my mother's smile, the way our faces share the same shadow and shine. For the first time, I don't need the red light to see who I am.